Okay, so after Napoleon, we have a period in Europe where we have tremendous, as I mentioned in our previous lecture, rapid economic, social, and political change. So we're going to talk a little bit about that this time. Yay! Okay, so after Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo for the last time, the Congress of Vienna is going to resume its negotiations about what will happen to Europe. Now, they'd begun this before he even came back for the 100 Days. It gets interrupted, and now they're going to have to pick up where they left off, debating on what to do. And once again, Clemens von Metternich, who's the Austrian ambassador, is going to fight alongside his ally, Robert Castlereagh from Britain, and argue that France needs to be left, at least in some way, important and powerful as a nation in Europe in order to create this balance of power idea. And this whole notion that the best way toward peace is to create a situation where a number of different nations are all very powerful and they can kind of counterbalance each other, weigh one against another, where there isn't one strong enough to dominate the rest, is going to be a crucial diplomatic idea at this time. Okay, so as they attempt to set this up, they're going to carve out some new boundaries, and there'll be some new changes to the map. Belgium is going to exist as an independent country for the first time. You can see it's right here on the map. This is territory that France used to control outright. It also, before it was French territory, with Napoleon and his conquest of basically everything, it had been considered part of the Netherlands. If you remember way back several weeks ago, the Netherlands are divided into a northern and southern part. The northern part is where you have mostly Protestants. They made a lot of their money on maritime trade. The southern part is where you had more Catholics. There's a linguistic difference as well between Flemish and French, etc., that are spoken elsewhere in Belgium later. And in the southern part, which will later become Belgium, it's more agrarian. There's more farmers. There's more Catholics. They've always sort of conceived of themselves as slightly culturally different from the northern Netherlands. And so at this point, the Netherlands are going to split. The Netherlands will become the north part, and Belgium is the south part there. Also, territory on that border between what is now France and what is now Germany, Alsace and Lorraine, is going to be reapportioned and given back on over to the German side at this point. So France is going to have to give up that territory. Spain is going to be independent. The monarchies of France and Spain are going to be restored. I'll talk about those in just a second. In the meantime, Central Europe is something of a mess. Italy as well. Parts of it had been more or less independent for a while with the help of Napoleon. Then they were dominated by Napoleon with his big empire. They're not really certain what their place is going to be. They're being claimed by the Austrian Empire again. There's just all this fighting. Spain claims the southern part of Italy. There's just chaos where that is concerned. And then Central Europe is somewhat chaotic as well. At this time, there's a discussion about whether, in order to create that balance of power, it might make sense if Central Europe were to coalesce into a big nation that could be a rival to Austria, to France, to Spain, to Great Britain, if it could be a single big country instead of a bunch of little independent principalities, which is the way it had worked. And so there's this talk that they should create a German confederation. And this talk reflects a lot of the new ideology that's really becoming popular in the 19th century. It's nationalist ideology. And what this means, this modern nationalism, in this context, is that you have a lot of political philosophers arguing that national boundaries should not be drawn in the traditional way by inheritance or conquest or whatever else, where you have monarchs who are kings and queens, and we'll put the border where it goes because they happen to have conquered this or because they happen to have inherited that. Instead, there's an argument that nations should be self-determined, that people should be able to have a national boundary that reflects who they feel they are as a culture. So if you speak the same language, if you have the same religious tradition, if you have the same kind of material culture, live in the same kinds of houses, and have the same types of tools, and use the same kinds of ways of making a living, that kind of thing, you generally share this cultural identity and think of yourselves as part of this ethnic group, that your national boundaries should reflect who you feel you are as a people. And that's what this modern nationalism comes to be associated with. It's going to get roped in together with a lot of really nasty racist ideologies, as well as some religious intolerant ideologies and all kinds of other things. But at this point, it's still a very new idea, and it's kind of being floated out there. And so the people who come up with this idea of the German Confederation draw their mental map of where that should go. And you can see it pictured here with that blue line, or purple line, depending on how it looks on your monitor. They draw it based on where the linguistic barrier is. That inside that purple line is where a lot of people speak German or something very similar to German. And so when they were coming up with this idea of the German Confederation, they're like, it should be a country for people who consider themselves to be Germans. There's a political problem with that. As you can see where that purple line goes, it bisects whole bunches of regions. It cuts right through the territory the Kingdom of Prussia is going to claim, and the part that's to the east of that is Poland. Then you see that it cuts kind of right through the Austrian Empire. So you can imagine the Austrians are dead against this. They're like, no way, we're having a German Confederation that divides half of our empire and ropes it into them. That's crazy, we're not doing it. Prussia, interestingly enough, is also going to be against the German Confederation. The other little German principalities like Hanover and Saxony and various the others are really generally in favor of this idea, because rather than being a small independent nation, it really benefits them politically if they can glom all together and be a single powerful nation to balance off places like France and Britain. But Prussia is a little bit two-faced about the whole situation. On the one hand, leaders like the King of Prussia are going to give a lot of speeches about how the idea of a united Germany is a great idea. But at the same time, when the idea is floated about maybe creating this German Confederation that will be a sort of a loose organization of independent states that are all kind of going to vote on what we do together in order to act and get trade benefits and that sort of thing, they really are going to end up torpedoing that idea. They're like, well, no, that's not really what we were thinking. Because what the King of Prussia is thinking is that if there's going to be a united Germany, it's going to be organized and run and ruled by him, the King of Prussia. So they end up quietly sinking this idea at the same time that in many cases their leaders are giving speeches saying what a good idea it is. Nationalism is going to be a tool like that. It's going to be very much used in a manipulative way by leaders who are seeking to kind of expand their own power. As I mentioned, in France and Spain, the monarchies are going to be restored. In France, Louis XVIII is going to be the guy on the throne. He's actually the brother of Louis XVI, the guy who got guillotined and his head chopped. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette did have a son who was never on the throne. And that's why it jumps from Louis XVI, who was the last king to actually be king in France, to Louis XVIII, because when he comes to the throne, out of respect for this kid who was never king, who was dead before 1820, well, he's dead before Louis XVIII comes to the throne, and Napoleon leaves power. Nevertheless, Louis XVIII acts as though he was always the next king in line. So even though he wasn't crowned and he wasn't on the throne, they acknowledge him as the rightful king of France. And so he calls himself Louis XVIII instead. And then Ferdinand VII of Spain comes to the throne as well. He's also part of this Bourbon dynasty, this Bourbon household. And they both come back to power. Now, they're a little different in terms of restoration monarchs from, say, what happens with Charles II in England. Charles II was very much the partier-in-chief, if you remember, and took a very light role in governance, and instead kind of restored and relaxed a lot of the restrictions that the Puritans had put on. Well, it's a very different kettle of fish in France and Spain. Many of the people who removed the monarchy in the first place did so with a lot of very legitimate grievances and in favor of progressive legislation that allowed for representative government. Not all of that is going to be eroded, but there's a big question mark over what's going to happen with the government now. Elites, nobles who had fled France and Spain when the revolutions hit there out of fear for their safety come flooding back in, and what they find is their chateaux have been burned down, their properties have been destroyed, some of them have been seized and other people are living on them, stuff has been wrecked, they've ruined they don't have their traditional privileges, they've lost all their wealth, and so they go running to the king, Louis XVIII, and demanding that he do something. He's like, well, we've come back to France, and now we want to be restored to our traditional position. We want all our property back. We want to be indemnified. We want to be given payments. We want to be given money from the government to compensate us for all the stuff that was destroyed during the revolution. You're going to have to do these things. And Ferdinand VII of Spain has the same phenomenon. Nobles come streaming in, they demand to have these payments, they demand to have their traditional privileges restored, and they want all this done now. Louis XVIII is not an idiot. He looks at the political situation in France. I mean, there was all those years of revolution, bloody revolution, and then Napoleon, and he's like, you know what? No, I'm not going to do that. You can come back to France. You can reclaim property that you can demonstrate was your family's, but no, the government's not going to pay you or compensate you for the destruction of the revolution. You're just out of luck. Sorry. Also, when it comes to traditional privileges being restored, no, we're not going to go back. We're just going to move forward, get used to it. You're going to have to deal with constitutional monarchy. That's the way it is. Ferdinand VII is not that smart, and so when the nobles press him and are like, you've got to have to indemnify us, you're going to have to give us our privileges, he tries to give in. He tries to do that. And the minute he does, there's more revolution in Spain. So Spain's constant chaos is just going to keep rolling on. They're going to be in a state of almost constant revolution for, well, forever, basically. But it's going to go on in part because Ferdinand is an idiot, and when the nobles press him, he gives in, and he's like, sure, I'll try to restore you to your traditional place, and that's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. Okay, so this is a time of culturally an effort to rebuild. It's a time to kind of smooth things over, to calm things down. Some of the processes, interestingly enough, that was begun by Napoleon, reconciliation with the Catholic Church, for instance, and outside places that were Catholic, there's another kind of religious revival that's going to spring up as well. There's this kind of effort to, in a post-revolutionary era, when many people had been turning their back on the traditional structures of organized religion as oppressive and tools of, kind of crushing the common person, there's this effort to mend fences and to bring back stability and reimagine religion in a kinder, gentler sort of way. And so you can see that both on the Catholic side and the Protestant side. On the Catholic side, the Jesuits are back. They had been disbanded, if you remember, by colonialists who were mad that they were interfering with Spain's efforts to grab up territory and rule it with conquistadors. But they're going to be kind of brought back to try to bring people, especially like revolutionaries in France, gently back into the fold of the Catholic Church. And in this case, the Jesuits are very successful. But what they're going to what they're going to focus on is not so much grabbing up people who had never been Catholic before. Instead, they're trying to sort of reconvince and convince people in Europe and in the Americas as well that the Catholic Church has something to offer them. This is the standard Jesuit MO. And what they latch on to is the thing so many people were dissatisfied with the revolution and had started to get with Napoleon, but it hadn't really fully sort of arrived at. The access to higher education, particularly college-level education. It's something that common people traditionally just didn't have. There weren't a lot of institutions of higher learning, and traditionally they were kind of the backyard. They were the wheelhouse of nobles and almost no one else. And so what the Jesuits begin offering people in the Americas as well as in Europe is access to this kind of education, the kind of education that would make you into a gentleman, the kind of education that would make it possible for you to actually occupy those important jobs in government and in academia and in other professions that are kind of the highest, most respectable ones. And so the Jesuits found a whole bunch of colleges, and they reach out to people and they make education available to people who would not have had it available to them in the past. And in this way, they kind of make a soft inroad into trying to bring people back into the benefits of the church, as it were. You see a similar kind of ideological revival on the Protestant side. Rather than hardcore Calvinism or the kind of the strict Puritanism of somebody like Oliver Cromwell, which was really perceived as oppressive and unpleasant. Now there's going to be an upsurge in groups like the Methodists, particularly the Methodists themselves, where they are going to promote an idea of religiosity that is a bit different from what had been expressed earlier. It's one that focuses on a personal relationship with divinity, with God, the Creator, and one that focuses on a very positive relationship. This is the moment where God is love becomes a mantra of at least some groups. Before that, God, very dangerous, very angry, punishing everybody. That was the idea. The Methodists are the one that promote this idea of this kind of eternally caring, eternally forgiving, gentle, community encouraging kind of image of God. And it becomes massively popular. People who are upset, who are frightened, who are disrupted by, almost at this point, decades and decades of war, really see this as something to latch onto and to embrace. Major philosophical developments at this time as well. Okay, so Edmund Burke, we talked about his writing already in the last reading roundup, if you've seen that. He's going to be known as the father of modern conservatism. And this is conservatism with a capital C. It's a little bit confusing. I mentioned this in the reading roundup a little bit, I suppose, because conservatism can be used as a relative term as well. So you could be anything from a person who favors democracy to a person who favors monarchy, and you could be either more liberal or more conservative, depending on where you fall on a scale. Generally speaking, conservatives are identified with the idea of adhering to tradition, sticking to tradition, and fighting change. Edmund Burke's capital C conservatism is a more specific philosophical ideology. And in his case, he is going to make an argument that tradition is the thing we ought to put above everything else when we're making our political decisions. We should trust institutions. We should trust things like the monarchy, which has lasted for millennia. We should trust things like the church, which has lasted for millennia. We should not be jumping to try to find new ways of making political reality happen. We shouldn't be having revolutions. We shouldn't be trying to create something like democracy. It isn't going to work. And if we did try to do that, we should model ourselves on things that have been proven to work, like the ancient world had. That's his idea. And he's going to support this notion by reinforcing the idea in his writing that class differences are based on real differences between people, that it's not just a matter of circumstance. He denies the writing of people like Locke that argues that everybody's essentially equal. Instead, he's like, no, that's just not how it goes. I mean, maybe you're morally equal to one another, but the fact is people really are different. And you can chalk this up to education if you want, but the fact is common people can't be put in charge of a government because they're common, because they're dumb, because they're easily manipulated, and because they're going to make terrible choices. So I've got a quote here that's directly from him, where he expresses the snobbery. The occupation of a hairdresser or working tallow chandler, that's a person who makes candles, cannot be a matter of honor to any person, to say nothing of a number of more servile employments. Such men ought not suffer oppression by the state, but the state suffers oppression if such as they, either individually or collectively, are permitted to rule. He basically says people are not equal. Telling them they're equal is only going to cause violence and disappointment, and it's a terrible thing to do to people. And everybody has to just embrace the idea that maybe you're a ditch digger. Too bad. That's just how it is. You should not try to change that. On the contrasting side, you have a wave of liberal thinkers, and this is liberalism with a capital L. Again, sometimes it's used relatively to say that somebody, I mean, you could be someone who supports monarchy, for instance, but you could be more liberal, where you would think, well, I support monarchy, but I would also agree that perhaps we ought to have some parliament or some kind of representative check or balance or something along those lines. Or you could be less liberal. In this case, capital L liberalism as a political philosophy is associated with this guy, Jeremy Bentham. And it's based roughly on a very Aristotelian, you don't have to know the details of that, but an Aristotelian political philosophy known as the golden mean. It's the idea that the best thing to do for people is to give them the most freedom you possibly can. That's why it's called liberalism. And that doesn't mean complete freedom to do whatever you want. It's fine to have laws and all that kind of stuff. But the best choice, and this is what I mean by the golden mean, is that perfect middle ground. The best choice is the one, the government, however it actually plays out, where the greatest number of people achieve the greatest amount of happiness. That's the idea. So a system where you have one person who is running everything and is really rich and really doing great, and everybody else is poor and working hard and suffering, is a terrible system, according to Jeremy Bentham. So old traditional monarchy, where you have one person with power and everybody else suffers, that's something he would reject. Similarly, he's going to point out that even if we're talking about numbers, it doesn't just boil down to numbers. So if you had a system, for instance, this is just hypothetical, where 80% of people are doing great, but the 20% on the bottom are enslaved, are being treated horribly and oppressed, then that's not a good system either, because the terrible severity of their suffering is going to negate any good that's being done to the people who are in the middle, who are on top. So Bentham argues that extremes need to be avoided, but that generally the best kind of government is the one that gives most people freedom. It's the one that gives most people the right to pursue education, most people the right to pursue whatever job they would like to pursue, the right to participate in government, to make choices about their political future. That's the best system, is one that allows most people to participate and most people to achieve happiness. And in order to do that, you're going to need some things. You're going to need education to be available to everyone. You're going to need laws that protect everyone's rights. You need all of these things in place for that kind of society to work. And that means a bunch of stuff is going to have to change about how things are traditionally done in Europe. Along with Bentham, you have John Stuart Mill, who's going to support these ideas as well. John Stuart Mill is famous for writing a couple of texts. Utilitarianism is the ideology he's most associated with, and that's very similar to what we just talked about with Bentham. Utilitarianism is the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number is the best thing to do, with exceptions being made for doing something really horrible to a small number of people. So in other words, I can't just kill someone and take all their stuff, because the tiny amount of good it would do for me to have, 1/1,000,000th of a person's wealth is totally overwhelmed by the terrible harm it would do to kill that one person. At any rate, so utilitarianism is the basic idea that the best choice, the most moral choice, is the one that does the most good for the most people. He's going to write very specifically about oppressed groups of people, specifically women, very famously. And he's going to be a proponent of women's rights. Now, the women's rights movement, we talked about it with the French Revolution. It's never gone away, but it suffered some very serious setbacks, and we saw how Napoleon rolls back and cuts away some of the legal rights and protections for women in France. This idea is being promoted elsewhere in England, etc., as well, as a backlash to the extreme French Revolution. Because the French Revolution was perceived as so radical and so destructive and so violent and so dangerous, a lot of the ideas that are associated with it are similarly perceived as dangerous and radical, even if they might not otherwise be. So at this time you have kind of a dueling theories, where you have some people who are going to argue that women's place is in the home, that they should not have any right to vote, they shouldn't pursue higher education, they should accept their traditional place. And at the same time, you have people like Mill who are going to argue the opposite side. I have a couple of very relatively famous quotes where he's going to make this logical argument. In the first, I deny that anyone knows or can know the nature of the two sexes as long as they have only been seen in their present relation to one another. Until conditions of equality exist, no one can possibly assess the natural differences between women and men, distorted as they have been. What is natural to the two sexes can only be found out by allowing both to develop and use their faculties freely. Mill is here making a logical argument against people like Edmund Burke, who will say it's unnatural to allow women to control their own property. It's not something they naturally can do. It's unnatural to allow them to want to train to be doctors, for instance. They can't do it. It's unnatural for them to pursue professions or otherwise occupy government jobs or something along those lines. Mill would say, well, we have no idea what's natural, because if you are legally prohibiting women from doing things, then you have no idea what they're naturally capable of. He reinforces that with the second quote. The anxiety of mankind to intervene on behalf of nature is an altogether unnecessary solicitude. What women by nature cannot do, it is quite superfluous to forbid them from doing. So, in other words, if your argument, like Burke's argument, is that it's unnatural and that women naturally can't do it, then there's absolutely no reason to make a law that says they can't attend medical colleges, because if they can't do it, they won't do it. So, obviously, the logic there is that people who are trying to bar women legally are, in fact, not using nature appropriately as a good argument, but instead are just cobbling together excuses. So, that's Mill. All right, so back to some political developments. Between 1811 and 1830, while Napoleon is going through his last gasps of rebellion, the 100 Days and all that kind of jazz, his fight with Russia, all those things, Europe is absolutely embroiled with those conflicts with Napoleon. Spain in particular has not any wherewithal to do anything about its colonial territories. So during that time period, between 1811 and 1830, there's going to be a massive revolutionary series of movements in Spanish colonial territory, places that were controlled and considered New Spain, and Portugal as well. They're going to stage a series of revolutions, and they're going to overthrow colonial control kind of piecemeal, one after another, after another, after another. Two of the leaders of these revolutionary movements include Simon Bolivar, you can see him there on the left, and then San Martin of Argentina, Jose de San Martin, and they are going to kind of lead simultaneous revolutionary movements to overthrow Spanish colonial governments. What they decide to do afterwards is very different from what we saw in the 13 colonies, the British colonies of North America. Instead of trying to create a single kind of United States of South and Central America, and even, I guess, Mexico would be in North America too, but instead of trying to create a single united former Spanish colony states, the decision is made that it's just too big a spread. The territory is too large, that it's too geographically, politically, ethnically diverse. And so Bolivar and San Martin decide that what they should do is create independent states, independent nations out of the former colonies. And so they set them all up with independent government, with representative governments in each of them, and allow local leaders to kind of take over control over all of these territories. Kind of the way it could have gone in the United States, if the Federalists had not won the day, it could have played out that New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Virginia would have all been independent nations, little tiny countries on their own, that were loosely allied with each other. That's what happens in South America. So all of these colonies go their own way and end up as independent nations kind of allied with each other. And Spain can do literally nothing about this because they're in the middle of that disaster that was revolution, followed by Napoleon, followed by Wellington and this Peninsular War. They're just too preoccupied to put up much of a fight in terms of trying to hang on to their colonies. The rest of Europe thinks about whether this might be an opportunity, however, to swoop on in and grab up territory in the former Spanish colonies. So you had Austria and Britain in particular, and even France flirts with the idea that they might swoop on in and try to grab up territory away that was now newly independent and try to make it part of their own empires instead. And so what happens in 1823 is that James Monroe, now Napoleon's been put away at this point, James Monroe steps up. There was a debate, and Congress decides to back him on this, and James Monroe, who's the President of the United States, issues something called the Monroe Doctrine, or explains it, in which he declares the Western Hemisphere, so both North and South America, to be an American sphere of influence that is going to be just kind of claimed for the United States. He doesn't say that he's going to rule all of this in any way, but if you want to come in and grab territory, or if you want to come in and interfere politically with this territory in North or South America, that means that you would have to tangle with the United States, that Monroe was willing to send the U.S. Navy out to protect these new republics and keep forces from Europe from coming in and interfering. Now, this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it does effectively protect the new republics of South America and Central America from being simply steamrolled over by places like Austria and France and Britain over the next century or so. But on the other hand, it puts them very much under the domination politically of the United States, and that's going to play out to their detriment in a lot of ways. It also doesn't protect a lot of these countries, like Argentina, for instance, from economic interference, and massive investment in railroads and various other infrastructure projects from the British and others are going to end up making these new governments very much in a vulnerable position when it comes to other places in the world, which we can talk about a bit more next time. Okay, so other massive developments. We have technology. During the 19th century, leaps and bounds forward are being made in steam technology in particular. Steam locomotives, both for trains and then boats, are going to revolutionize both the shipping industry and, to a far greater extent, the railroad is going to transform the landscape. First in Britain, where it's developed earliest, and then elsewhere in the world, the United States, Europe itself. What it does is it transforms what is possible in the economy. Because coal-powered locomotives can carry almost unlimited amounts of weight, they can move tremendous loads of things from one place to another. That's primarily what they're good at. What it makes possible is the movement of steel, first and foremost. And that it's a little bit of a circular argument here. But technological innovations in the development of steel make the railroads possible because it makes it possible to cheaply build those rails, or relatively cheaply, that are strong enough to hold a train on them without just bending and warping and dumping everything on the ground. And also, this kind of new steel is going to make big buildings possible in a safe way. It's going to make it possible to expand the factory system. It's going to make it possible to build all kinds of new things in places that didn't have them, especially factory-based infrastructure inland. Prior to the development of the steam locomotive, really, goods that were heavy could only be moved relatively short distances before it became prohibitively expensive. And the train changes that. You can move huge loads of coal, which will be the fuel that runs the Industrial Revolution, far inland as long as there's a railroad. You can move steel far inland as long as there's a railroad. And places that would never have developed into large cities suddenly do. And so it really is going to transform trade. It's going to transform the urban environment. It's going to transform everything in Europe in the 19th century. Shipping is also going to be changed by the development of steam. It's going to happen a little bit more slowly, but basically what happens is that steamships become faster and more reliable than sailing ships, and they begin slowly to replace them. Industrial machinery, huge leaps forward. You can see up in the upper left, that's a spinning jenny. That was one of the earliest kind of industrial machines for producing textiles in Britain. By the time you get into the middle of the 19th century, we're talking about the factories we all picture when we picture a factory. Huge, just hundreds and thousands of moving parts, lots and lots of workers all smushed in together. These machines that are all going enormously fast, producing goods at an incredible rate. People who own factories, people who profit by them, are making a ton of money off of this industrial revolution. The workers are not necessarily benefiting from it equally. As you can see from the mix of people that are there, you can sort of see probably this kid here, right there. Lots of them are women, lots of them are children. We already talked about this in lecture, where women and children are very attractive employees to factories because they don't have to be paid as much as adult men. And so factory owners are strongly incentivized to hire the cheapest workers they can get and then pay them as little as possible. And because so many people are desperate for work, people who take these jobs are working for very, very low wages, usually in extremely long hours, usually extremely terrible conditions. The air quality is bad. People are dying of that. In the coal mines, which is another huge industrial boom at this time, black lung is killing people, as you can imagine. Cave-ins, floods, all kinds of things are terribly happening to them. In the factories, it's only a little bit safer. The machines are dangerous, and the air is absolutely full of particulates. Like this is a textile mill. You see all the fluffy stuff on the ground. That's most likely cotton, and it's cotton fluff. And there's nothing wrong with cotton. It's not toxic or anything. But once you aerosolize a particle and it gets into the air, if you inhale that into your lungs, it damages the lungs. And so people who are working in these conditions end up with the equivalent of black lung. It's like white lung. It's cotton lung. From working in these factories, and they end up becoming ill, and their mortality rate is enormously escalated. This was causing enough of a problem. There were a lot of pressures in Britain. Now, they escaped the revolution, the French Revolution, by the skin of their teeth. But there's a tremendous amount of political pressure to change some of the conditions that were making things really harsh and difficult for people. In 1832, the Reform Act is going to expand franchise, the right to vote. It's still only men. I don't want anybody to get too excited here. But it expands the right to vote to people who don't necessarily fall into that category where it's just landowners, it's just people who have property, it's just the wealthy. Instead, it's going to expand the right to vote to a much larger percentage of the population, if you're male. Okay, Britain is going to go embark on a whole series of social reforms. They're going to try to address a bunch of what they perceive to be ills in their society, sort of unpleasantnesses. In 1833, they're going to abolish slavery in their own colonies. So everybody's emancipated if you're in British territory. This doesn't have quite the effect that you might imagine, because in 1833, Britain they've established themselves as this big factory textile producing empire. A lot of what they're producing in these textile mills is cotton fabric that they're selling to various colonies around the world, particularly India. We'll get to that in just a bit. But the material for it doesn't grow in England. They can't produce it. Instead, it's produced mostly in the American South. That's going to be the major producer that's going to supply the British factory system. And even though the British abolished slavery in their own colonies, they are still doing a very heavy trade with slave economies around the world, particularly the American South, where most of these big cotton plantations are slave plantations, not all, but most, and they are profiting off of the slave economy there. So on the flip side, and those plantation owners, just as a quick side before I move on, are making a tremendous amount of money. British demand for cotton is very high. Prices are quite respectable. And so those slave plantations are raking in the dough. And so the people who are running that system are strongly incentivized to keep it going. On the flip side, in 1833, also, there's a Factory Act that's passed in Britain to try to address the concerns that are being raised by social reformers. Among them, Sir Edwin Chadwick, which we'll talk about with our reading roundup, who are complaining about the living conditions and the working conditions of people in British factories and factory towns. And some of what Chadwick and others complain about is this reality of children and women working in these factories and coal mines, and it being so terrible for their health and just generally bad. And so in 1833, a Factory Act is passed in order to try to prevent the worst of these abuses. So children under 9 are no longer allowed to work in the factories. Children between 9 and 13 are only allowed to work 9 hours a day, and between 13 and 18 only 12 hours a day, which is shocking, but this was an improvement. Think about that for a moment. This was an improvement over the conditions that were prevalent before the Factory Act. The Mine Act of the 1840s, there's a few of them kind of in quick succession. The Mine Acts are the similar kind of thing. They're designed to try to respond to public outcry. There had been a series of mining disasters in the 1830s, 1838 or so. There was a massive one where something like 26 children died in a coal mine because there was a thunderstorm and the mine flooded. It was a whole long, horrible story. Anyway, in the 1840s, there's a series of mine acts that are designed to improve conditions in the coal mines. And they do things like regulate the amount of headspace in shafts that people are working in. You can see this political cartoon that was designed to demonstrate and illustrate just how horrible the conditions were. There was so much pressure being put on the economy to produce more coal, to run the factories, to heat houses. Coal was the center of the Industrial Revolution. And so coal mines were under enormous pressure to produce as much as they can, as fast as they can. And so a lot of corners are being cut. People were digging down shafts that were so small that people couldn't stand upright in them. They're pushing up. You can see here it's 3 people pushing up a big coal cart with one person pulling in the front with it tied to her probably, and a couple people pushing from the back. And so everybody who could get a job in these coal mines was working in horrible conditions. They're very dangerous. Collapses were relatively common. Also, coal tends to be found in the same places as natural gas. And natural gas is highly explosive and odorless in its natural form. The smell, if you have natural gas in your house, if you've smelled that like sulfur smell that shows that, you know, if you had turned on your like stove burner too fast or something, that's actually an additive that's put into the natural gas for safety for the home consumer. It naturally has no odor at all. And this creates a great deal of danger in coal mines, because if you're in a place where the air is filling up with natural gas, and then you're also using kind of a hammer and a pick, you could strike a spark and blow the whole place sky high. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that in environments like that, you could be filling your living space with non-breathable air, and that kills people as well. Which is where you get the canary in the coal mine from, that idea, because miners would carry down little birds like canaries with them, and because birds were much more sensitive, and so if the canary didn't do too well, if they suddenly keel over and die, or they look like they're struggling, you realize, oh no, there's not enough breathable air, we got to get out of here. So at any rate, the Mine Act was designed to try to improve conditions, and it's motivated not just by public outcry over people suffering in their working conditions, but it also, and this is an interesting twist to a lot of how these rules get passed and these laws get passed, there was a whole lot of pamphlets issued before the act gets passed about the scandalous nature of the workers in the coal mines, where you had women who were working side by side with men, wearing trousers, sometimes topless. whole argument that they were, because they're sweating and working in a coal mine, and that this is a scandalous, immoral behavior, that these kinds of conditions are creating the moral degradation of our society, and that's why we need these laws. Well, whatever the motivations were, the laws do get passed, improving working conditions in the coal mines and blocking children, particularly girls, from working underground in the mine until they reach a certain age. Nevertheless, with all of that said, the conditions in Britain are horrifying in these industrial towns. You have massive amounts of coal pollution. You have massive amounts of sewage type pollution, where you have raw sewage running more or less untreated into the water supply in many cases. You have massive overcrowding, dozens of people living in single rooms. You have poor to non-existent sanitation. You have no water treatment at all. You have all kinds of compromised water supply. You have terrible diets. You have people living on starvation wages, where they are struggling to keep themselves literally alive. And so all of that creates these perfect conditions for epidemic disease. So this will be where we leave off on this particular lecture. There are going to be a series of pandemics that are going to just basically swing across Europe, and they're going to hit the Americas as well, though less hard because the population isn't as dense. But cholera in particular. Cholera is a disease that is spread by contaminated water supply, and it is going to ultimately kill, by the time the 19th century is over, something like 45 million people in India, Russia, and Europe. Single outbreaks, like in 1849 in Paris, are going to kill 15,000 people all at once. Now, I want to emphasize that when cholera kills people, this is not the kind of disease like COVID is, where it's easy to transmit it from one person to another by coughing or sneezing. It's the kind of thing that spreads much more slowly, but it nevertheless becomes a horrible epidemic because pollution is so rampant, because corruption of the water supply is so terrible and pervasive. So many people are reliant on these basically poisoned water, that that's how you have these massive outbreaks of cholera, typhus, scarlet fever. Some of these are communicable in regular ways, but you have these massive, enormously deadly, horrible pandemic outbreaks that just begin killing people by the thousands and ultimately millions. This tragedy ultimately is in the same way that the conditions in Britain prompt the British Parliament and British government to try to actually take steps to do something about it. These pandemics actually start putting pressure on governments, like in Britain, to do something about it. And so you see a wave following the cholera epidemic of increased concern with public health and with providing the infrastructure for public sanitation. Some of the work that's being done at this time, for instance, by John Snow in the 1850s, and he's a physician, and another named Robert Koch in the 1880s, are going to make huge leaps forward in understanding disease at all, and the germ theory of disease and how it spread from one place to another. Remember that microscopy, or the study using microscopes, is not invented yet. People don't have them. They've never seen a germ. They aren't really sure how this works. And that's changing right at this time in the 19th century. That's something that's being worked on. The idea of contamination, of things being in the air, in the water, people being exposed in this way, is something that is really being developed and is going to be understood really for the first time during that time period. And so changes, like John Snow very famously identified how the outbreak of cholera was being spread in London by realizing that there was a pump where the water was contaminated and everybody who was using this well was getting sick. And he went down and very famously closed that well and said, don't touch this water, you'll get cholera and die. And those kinds of advances are going to start the process whereby governments start taking on responsibility for creating building codes, for creating sanitation that is provided for free to the public in order to prevent this kind of thing from happening.